It's Women's History Month, and I'm dressed and ready to campaign for the women's vote. It's a great time to talk about voting in the Hopewell Valley. We didn't always have private curtained voting booths at our polling places like we do today. Before that, we had ballot boxes. We have 4 vintage ballot boxes in our collection here at the museum. The only one whose provenance is known is this wood and glass one here in the front. When the Hopewell Borough Hall moved down to East Broad Street, the fire department bought its building at the corner of South Greenwood and Columbia Avenue. When they were renovating the space in 2019, they found this box up in the attic, along with 4 others like it. Along with the boxes, the fire department also found ballots, stacks of ballots. This pink ballot is an emergency voting form. It's dated 1950. Over here on the right, there is space for a voting record going back to 1927. The other ballots that were found with the boxes were these white general election ballots. This is also from 1950, and the names of the candidates are listed on the ballot. If you're a longtime Hopewellian, you'll recognize some of the names on this ballot. Ballot boxes often displayed a party affiliation, either by initial or by name. For example, this ballot box of ours shows an R on the cover. It's not Rutgers, it's for Republican. Some of the other boxes found in the firehouse attic spelled out Republican in full on the lids. So why would ballot boxes display party affiliation? Isn't voting a private act? Well, it wasn't always so. At the beginning of our country, voting was by viva voce, meaning voice voting. The voter would go into the courthouse and cast the vote out loud. At the time, of course, only white men with property could vote. Carousing and campaigning at the polls was allowed, so election days could get to be quite the drunken free-for-all. That could explain why polling places and the vote itself was considered inappropriate for women. Paper ballots began to replace voice voting in the early 1800s. At first, it was nothing standardized. You would just fill out your candidate's name on a piece of paper and drop it into the box. In time, newspapers began to print blank ballots that you could clip out and fill in. Eventually, political parties began to distribute their own ballots. They were called tickets because they resembled train tickets. But even so, they displayed the slate of candidates only for one party. Ballots were often colorful and included artwork, not just wording. Political parties wanted to reach all voters, even those who couldn't read. This ballot is a Free Soil ticket. It's from 1849. The Free Soil Party was a one-issue party that opposed the expansion of slavery into the West. This stylized drawing of a tree would have been familiar to voters of the time. Of course, they were still just white men voting. African-American men didn't get the vote until 1870, and of course, women not until 1920. Ballots that represented all political parties, like the ones we found with our ballot boxes, began to appear in the late 1800s. They were modeled after ballots that were first used in the country of Australia. And it's interesting to note that Australia was one of the first countries to grant women the vote. They were second only to New Zealand. So in this era before private voting, you would walk into your polling place. You might see these ballot boxes on a table, on a platform, on a stage, And standing beside them, election officials, and then maybe arrayed around would be voters, your friends and neighbors. You would fill out your ballot in public. You would drop it into the box of your chosen party in public. Your friends and neighbors might cheer and applaud when you drop in your ballot, or they might boo and hiss when you drop it in. Voting could be a very brave act in those times. Now, let's talk about the women's vote. Women here in Hopewell were very involved in the suffrage fight. Suffragists in town met here at this house at 32 East Broad Street. It's the blue house right next to the museum. It was the home of one of the two doctors in town, George Van Nest, and his wife, Anna Van Nest. Anna was a prominent suffrage leader here in town. But the anti-suffragists were just as active here in town. They were meeting down the street at 25 West Broad Street, the home of Rose Egie. Rose was the wife of J. Mason Egie, who had a hardware store here in town. When the women needed larger venues for their talks, more seating, the anti-suffragists would meet here at the Grange Hall on Mercer Street. Today, it's number 12 and 14 Mercer Street, and it houses offices. The suffragists would meet at Columbia Hall, which today is the Hopewell Theater. It was quite the West Side Story here in town. Now, before women had the vote in 1920, some women had limited voting rights, say, for example, local elections or school board matters. That was the case here in Hopewell. In this article from a 1910 Hopewell Herald, we find the first instance of women voting in the Hopewell Valley. In this election, funding and a location for a new high school was being decided. It sounds like the women had to brave quite a vocal crowd. The writer of this article says, "The ladies of the town and vicinity were loyal to the cause, and many were the hardships they endured in the crowd rather than not vote for it." The writer goes on to say, "It was the first experience for some to exercise their right of suffrage, and they will have occasion to remember it for some time." Well, in that election, a site was chosen for the new high school and funding was approved. The women had part in choosing this building, this site here with this building. It's at the corner of Columbia Avenue and South Greenwood, the building that now houses our fire department and rescue squad. After women got the vote in 1920, it wasn't long before candidates realized that they had to court the women's vote. At first, it was just assumed that women would vote the way their husbands did or the way their fathers did. But pretty soon, candidates realized that women were going to vote their own minds. In this ad from a 1923 Hopewell Herald, a candidate for sheriff, Clinton Reed, who was in the legislature, campaigns by noting that he voted for women's suffrage. A couple years later, it was noted that elections were still quite rowdy here in town. In this article from a 1926 Hopewell Herald, the writer notes that the election of a sheriff was quite spirited. It sounds like the crowd bullied everyone into voting for one candidate, except for one single voter who was brave enough to vote for the other candidate. This is what the writer says about it. "It was more than an election. It was an orgy. It reminded me somewhat of the flying wedge play in the old-time football days." Well, our elections in Hopewell might be as hotly contested today, but for the most part, I think our election days are quite tame in comparison. We would love to know more about the ballot boxes in our collection. If you know anything about these 4 boxes, or if you have any voting memorabilia or stories about elections past, please contact us. We'd love to hear from you.